which is to be followed and which cannot change and which is true. And the Holy Quran propounds more or less the same kind of ideas. The Dharma Shastras, which are also called as Smritis, are subject to change. And they are subject to change with time. Because Smriti is something in the Indian tradition which lays down a law for a particular time in a particular area. Something 2,000 miles down or 500 miles down the country, that law need not be applicable. And it has been so in the country. You go to Himachal, in the villages, some of the old villages, you still find that one woman has 4 husbands. This is still in operation. And this is part of the sanction given by the Dharma Shastras. So the idea that law is not something which either the state or the religious authority shall define for all times to come is not an idea of the Indian schools of thought. It is something that comes from another culture. And somewhere or the other, even though the Indian Constitution allows amendments, it is written down with the presumption that it is not going to be changed that easy, that it is the best which has been given. Now, the concept of Shruti being the one that guides the Smriti needs to be understood. The Shruti is also not something that is finally defined, but Shruti is something which has to be understood. Because what is Shruti or the Samhita or the Vedic text? It does not lay down injunctions of do this and don't do this. It talks about rhythm or truth, and you have to apply your mind as to what is the right conduct at a given time for me. So in the Indian tradition, what was right for Ram, that is to obey Dasharath, in Treta Yuga may not be right for somebody today. And he can say that no, I will not do this just as Ram did. It is not a binding example on me, because times have changed, because situations have changed. So this is exactly the idea that the Dharma Shastra teaches you. Now, this idea is a very liberal idea. And the present day world is still struggling to define what is liberalism and pluralism. But the pluralism today has fallen down to such a degree that it ends up saying that one man's meat is another man's poison. That this may be good for you, so you do it, this may be good for you, you may do it. And it is only relativism and moral relativism by which you can live. There are no ultimate values. As a matter of fact, the very concept of values is something which is philosophically questionable. So in the present day world, there is so much confusion that either you have on one side the tradition that follows the law written in stone, or on the other hand, you have virtually no law. The Dharma Shastras made it very clear that there is no liberalism which can amount to unfettered behavior, but that there is a freedom to change the law, a freedom to make a new law, yet you are bound by law. Now, another aspect when we read the Dharma Shastras that comes to our mind is that they are texts of cultures which were non-consumeristic and non-individualistic. You see, you think of it, what happens is that all our thinking today centers around individual freedom. In matters of law, in matters of personal conduct, in matters of social relationships, what we value, under of course the impact of European thought, is individual interest. I don't like it. I think it this way. I look at it this way. This is my fundamental right. I am not going to ask anybody else. I am grown up now. I am making up my own mind. And the right of the individual is valued most. Now, this is not the classical vision. The classical vision was very clear. There is a shlok in the Mahabharata which says, Tyajet ekam kulasyarthe. Now, I am giving you a practical example. Although the shlok is not part of any Gautam Sutra or Manu or anybody, but it has been considered to be, because it is in Mahabharata and various other texts, as a valuable example for conduct. Tyajet ekam kulasyarthe. Give up the interest of the individual for the sake of the interest of the family. Tyajet ekam kulasyarthe. Tyajet ekam kulasyarthe. Gramarthe kulam tyajet. For the sake of the village or the city, give up the interest of the family. The interest of the family is secondary. Gramam tyajet janapadasya. And for the sake of Janapad or a bigger political entity, a Rashtra or a nation or a monarchy, for the sake of that, give up the interest of the gram. Ekam tyajet kulasyarthe, gramarthe kulam tyajet, gramam tyajet janapadasya, and finally atmarthe prithvim tyajet. And for the sake of the soul, not for the sake of the self. Atma. Atmarthe prithvim tyajet. Now, if you look at this hierarchy and you see what really is going on and who is centered, then you see an entirely different priority. And today, any young person or any liberal, even of my age, raised on a heavy dose of Western individualism, will find this unacceptable. He said, this is like putting me in a cage. You are taking away all my freedom. Because we have grown up on such romantic ideas of freedom. Now, the other thing that the Dharma Shastras were most concerned about was non-consumerism. Constant recycling of the sources. You see, they belong to cultures in which you did not have opulence, in which you did not have resources to waste, in which it was necessary to make the best of what you have. Now, these are not small things. If you go deep into it, it is very important. For instance, today everybody is highly critical of the Dharma Shastras or the older books or the texts which prescribe that a girl should be married at the age of 10 or 11 and she can be married off to a man of 30 or 25. Even the Chinese formula was that a man can take a wife which is half plus 7. So if he is 45, then he can marry a girl of 23. This was the Chinese formula. And if you go to any older culture, you will find this was perfectly not just acceptable, it was practiced, and it is repulsive to us today for the very simple reason that before 19th century, in most parts of the world, the average age was around 50, that more than half the women died in childbirth, that a large number of children died before they reached the age of 10, that in wars men were lost, and society was most concerned with raising population, which is exactly the opposite of what we are concerned today with, is to contain the population. I am not telling you an Alif Laila story. This is exactly how it was. And so, if a woman did not produce something like 10 children, out of which only 5 or 4 would survive, then any section, any area would just become without human beings within a generation or two. So it was very simple. And therefore, starting childbearing at a very early age was necessary. Because if you start having your first child at the age of 32, you can't have more than one child or two, and that also, unless you have a modern, All India Medical Institute to deliver your baby. Look at these very simple facts and then go to Dharma Shastras as to what was the society they talked about. So they were living in a world where consumerism was not the order of the day. Now we know that consumerism is not going to be the order of the day for very long. Maybe in another 20 or 25 years, it's all going to come to a halt. We can see signs of it. This kind of civilization which we have created just cannot go on. And you will come back to, you will have to create a civilization which is really sustainable growth. This is the modern slogan, sustainable growth. And hence the Dharma Shastras, which are non-romantic, are very real and should be studied again. Now, this does not mean that we should do exactly what they did in the past, but it is to take the spirit and to see. One of the reasons why the Dharma Shastras are castigated more than anything else is the Varna Ashram Vyavastha. You see, largely the Dharma Shastras were written in order to propound the Varna Ashram. Now, most of us don't even know what is ashram. We know Varna as Jati and Brahman, Kshatriya, Vaishya and Shudra hierarchy. But ashram is something we vaguely know about. Now, India has talked a lot, particularly under Christian criticism, about the unacceptability of the Varna ashram today, but it has not talked about ashram at all. Ashram is something which is biological. You see, The brahmacharya, the grihastha, the vanaprastha, and the sannyas were the 4 ashrams. Now these are biological, and by and large they are practiced in every civilization. You spend the first few years of your life in education, then in generating wealth, which is the grihasthashram, sangraha, lok sangraha, taking things. And then there comes a time when you have to hand it over and retire to the forest. Of course, there were forests. Now we have eaten up the forests. There are no forests. We have covered towns. But at least you can retire. And then finally, there was the idea of sannyas. Now these were civilizational values. And because India has totally alienated itself from the idea of these values and adopted the idea of the happy age of retirement, when you become more consumerist than ever, because you have all that money, you have your retirement benefits, you have your accumulation, you have your provident fund from the government, your investments, and then what do you want to do? You want to go on a holiday, you want to lie like a log of India rubber on sands in some foreign beaches. This is the idea with which we are now living. And you want to enjoy and relax. So some kind of a massage, some kind of a physical excitement is the idea of peace. And that is the final goal of life. If you are Christian and living in Christian West, then you have to book a grave. You have to give a huge advance and purchase a grave somewhere so that you can be buried, if not by your children, then by the one whom you have appointed. All these things that have crept up in modern European and American life, and which are now the ideals of the Indian life, abject consumerism, is something that the Dharma Shastras can take you out of, because they present a vision which is entirely antithetical, which is the opposite. And it is nobody else's vision. It is the vision of India itself. It is the vision which is still enshrined in our texts, in our Puranas, in our stories, in our literature, and in the deeper values at the back of the mind still. The examples of how in some very practical way Dharma Shastras legally can be upheld in amending certain ways of thought. I'll give you some of them. You see, it is always thought that the Varna ashram is what was prescribed, and the great task and the great guilt which was put on Indian, largely the Hindu civilization, was oppression of the Shudras, and hence the idea of Brahmana, Kshatriya, Vaishya and Shudra. The Shudra is at the bottom as the sufferer. It was considered as the only net result of that oppressive system. Now, look at certain other things. First of all, I believe that India was not very special in having a hierarchical social order. If you study Greek law, and if you study Greek civilizational ideals, then you will find Plato, who prescribes a system which is entirely oppressively hierarchical. A system which sometimes is believed by some to have been influenced by the Indian Varnashram. If you go to Europe, then you find that there were only the masters and the slaves. There was hardly any middle class till the 16th, 17th century. If you go to China, the situation was no better. In Japan, it was always worse. As a matter of fact, India is a society which was largely a middle class society. The very reason why India was such a prosperous society was that there was a huge middle class that produced and traded. And the bulk of the population was middle class. And that was middle class as a result of the Varna ashram. With the Brahman, the Kshatriya, but largely the Vaishya. And all Shudras were not untouchables. All Shudras were not who lived outside the town. Most of them were part and parcel of the daily economy and commerce, and some of them even became kings when they acquired power. Anyway, that is a subject in itself regarding the upward and the downward mobility in the system. But my point is that the guilt that we wear about the Varnashram is something which is a needless guilt. It was a system much better than other systems that prevailed in the pre-technological society. Now I come to the idea of marriage. And most of us, when we think of Manusmriti, then we think that the present day evil of dowry comes out of the Dharma Shastras. You will be surprised to know that there is no dowry prescribed in any of the Dharma Shastras. And as a matter of fact, there was not one but 8 kinds of marriages. 8 kinds of marriages which were not just prescribed but practiced in classical Indian society. There was, of course, the Brahma Vivaha, and the only condition for Brahma Vivaha was that there should be a tent, an achadan or a mandal, and that you should invite the bridegroom, or that he should invite you. In that case, it was not called Vivaha, but it was called Avaha. And with mantras, the daughter is given to the husband. And there is Kanyadan. Now, a lot of modern feminist discourse has objected to this word Kanyadan. A Sanskrit colleague of mine had her daughters seriously object to this, and they skipped this ritual of Kanyadan in their marriage. They said, am I an object that you gift? Now this is where the pathetic state of understanding a word like Dan exists. Dan was prescribed, as the tale goes in Brihadaranyaka Upanishad, where it was said that the most important thing for men was to gift.